Good evening and welcome into Sports Talk on a Budget. It is July 25th, year of our Lord 2024. Almost to the end of July. That means we're almost into August. Preseason for the NFL starts next week. Actually, the Hall of Fame game is going to be Thursday between the Bears and the Texans. We are only 4 Saturdays away from the first official weekend of college football, 3 Saturdays away from the week zero in college football. So football is in the air. You can smell it. You can feel it. And I love this time of year. Football is going to be a big part of this show. Also going to throw in some baseball as well. But before I go ahead and get to the topics of the show, I want to just say if you like this show, especially the video version on YouTube here under Sports Talk on a Budget, go ahead and like and subscribe right down here. Leave a comment if you'd like. If you prefer the audio version, I love my podcast listeners as well. You can find this podcast basically wherever you get your podcast, whether that be Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcast. Um, so please listen, subscribe, like the show, whatever you like to do there. But thank you to the people who are watching and listening right now. And let's go ahead and dive into the topics of the show. So as I mentioned a couple of weeks back, I am doing a series here for these last 2 weeks and 2 weeks going forward, breaking down two divisions in the NFL. So that'll be the first topic today. I'll break down the AFC and NFC North divisions, kind of the biggest question marks for each team in both of those divisions. Then we'll move to college football, and I'm moving conference by conference, at least in the Power Four, make it to the Group of Five at some point. But this is the Big Ten week for me. Big Ten Media Days is going on in Indianapolis right now. So I will break down the Big Ten, biggest question marks for some of the top teams and most of the teams in the Big Ten as well. And then finally, going to throw a little bit of baseball flavor in there. We are in the summer. We are basically past the All-Star break. We're heavy into baseball season. I had a friend over the weekend, Nick Feldman, a listener of the show. Thank you for always listening, Nick. He asked me who are my top five catchers all time. Catchers, of course, are a position that don't get talked about a lot. So listed out my top five catchers. That'll be the final topic of the show, and that's how I will end the show. But like I said, let's go ahead and dive into the show and dive into that first topic, and that is going to be in the NFL. And that is going to start with my AFC North breakdown. And when it comes to the AFC North, I feel like we have to start with the Baltimore Ravens. They are the reigning division champions in the AFC North. And when it comes to the Baltimore Ravens, it's not really about the regular season anymore for the Baltimore Ravens and John Harbaugh and quarterback Lamar Jackson, because we know they're going to compete for the division. We know they're probably going to compete for the number one seed in the AFC. What this comes down to now for the Ravens and Harbaugh and Lamar Jackson is what can they do in the postseason. Last year, Lamar Jackson was picked up just his second victory in the postseason in the divisional round against the Houston Texans. And then, of course, they were favorites at home in the AFC Championship game and had just a putrid offensive performance against the Kansas City Chiefs where they would go on to lose. Kansas City would go on to Super Bowl and win it. That's conversation for another day. But that is what it's going to come down to this year for the Baltimore Ravens. Can they finally take that next step? Can they get to a Super Bowl? Can they even win a Super Bowl? Is Lamar Jackson built for a postseason run at quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens? Huge question there. I'm not so sure he is, but that is the question that everybody has about the Baltimore Ravens. You bring in a guy like Derrick Henry, that is an intriguing addition for this team here, really gives them another rushing threat. Him and Lamar Jackson running the ball is going to be a scary thing for defenses, both in the AFC North and basically any team that this Ravens team plays. But like I said, it ain't about the regular season for the Ravens anymore. We know they'll be good in the regular season. It is all about the postseason. And then we'll move to the team who ended up winning the division 2 years ago, was actually back-to-back division champions a couple years ago, and that is the Cincinnati Bengals. And the question for the Bengals is simple. It centers around Joe Burrow. If Joe Burrow can stay healthy for an entire season, this team basically ends up in an AFC Championship game. Every season that Joe Burrow has started and finished for the Cincinnati Bengals since he's been there has ended up in an AFC Championship game or a Super Bowl. So you know with Joe Burrow healthy, this Cincinnati Bengals team is going to be good. They're going to be legit. Still have a ton of firepower on the offensive side. Still got Jamar Chase. Still got T. Higgins at least for this year. Chase Brown looks to be the guy, second-year running back out of Illinois. Looks to be their running back now. Got some other draft additions too. Defense is a little bit of a question mark, but still think that they'll play good defense, especially under defensive coordinator Lou Anarumo. So, like I said, with the Bengals, the biggest question and the only question I have for them is Joe Burrow and his health, Because like I said, when he is healthy and he plays a full season for this team, they are a really, really good team. Then we'll move to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And this Pittsburgh Steelers team, all they do is get over 500 to get into the playoffs when no one thinks they will. Halfway through the season, I did not think they were a playoff team. They somehow end up in the playoffs and find their way in there every year under Mike Tomlin. But the big question mark for me is it Russell Wilson or is it Justin Fields? It looks like it'll be Wilson to start the season. What does Wilson have left in the tank? Has some good weapons on that offensive side, whether it's George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth at the tight end position. You have Najee Harris and who's the other one? It's Jalen Warren is the other running back as well. So a good two-headed monster there. So does Russell Wilson have much left in the tank? Does Justin Fields end up coming in and taking over somewhere throughout the season? Because this team has been, they're going to play great defense with guys like Watt and Hayward and Fitzpatrick on the defensive side. They're going to play really good defense. The question is on the offensive side, and the question is really at the quarterback position. Kenny Pickett was definitely not the answer for this team. Their first-round draft pick a couple of years ago out of Pitts. That never worked out and never really gained enough steam for him to be the guy going forward. Can Russell Wilson or Justin Fields step in and be that guy? I have my reservations about both those guys, and we'll see. That's a big question mark, and that is kind of what's going to make or break the Steelers season is all going to come down to that quarterback position, as it often does. And then finally, we'll round that out, the AFC North, with the Cleveland Browns. And the question for the Cleveland Browns is, does that old Deshaun Watson that we saw in Houston, who was one of probably the 5 or 6 best quarterbacks in the league, does that guy still exist, or can he at least get half of that guy? Because you look at this Browns roster, they're stacked on the offensive side. We'll see what happens and see what kind of Nick Chubb we get coming back from injury. Jerome Ford played really well in his absence last year. You have good receivers. Amari Cooper is probably one of the most underrated players in the entire league. You bring over Jerry Jeudy. You have Elijah Moore. You have David Njoku at the tight end position. You have a stacked offensive line. Then you move over to the defensive side. You got guys like Denzel Ward, Myles Garrett's one of the best players in the league, let alone defensive players. So this is a stacked roster in Cleveland. And their biggest question mark is just like the Pittsburgh Steelers, because both those teams are really good rosters, but they have big question marks at quarterback. And if we can get Deshaun Watson to play anywhere near what he played in Houston, this is definitely a playoff team and maybe even more. Look what Joe Flacco did with him at the end of last year until he kind of turned back into old Joe Flacco in the playoffs. But this is a team that has talent all over the place, both on the offense and defensive sides of the ball. So they're a team that can compete with anybody as far as rosters. The biggest question mark is the most important position, and that is the quarterback position. And in this NFL in 2024, if you don't have the quarterback position figured out, you have no chance of winning a Super Bowl. You just don't. I don't care how good your roster is. I don't care how good your coaching staff is. If you don't have the quarterback position figured out, you don't win a Super Bowl, and you actually don't really make deep playoff runs either. So that is my question mark for the Cleveland Browns. And that was kind of my biggest question marks and breakdown of the AFC North. I think it's going to be a really competitive division. All 4 teams, I believe, have a chance to make the playoffs. To win the division, I really think it comes down between the Ravens and the Bengals, but I'll get into that a little bit more when I get into my overall NFL preview at the end of next month, early September. And then we'll move to what I think might be the best division in all of football, and that is the NFC North. And we'll start with the NFC North reigning division champions, and that is the Detroit Lions, a team that I thought should have been in the Super Bowl last year, got a little too aggressive, but that's what their head coach Dan Campbell is, and that's what he does. And that ended up costing him in the NFC Championship game against San Francisco, but this team is still loaded. Probably the best offensive line in football. You sign and extend Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's one of the most underrated players in all of football. You still have guys like Sam Laporta going into his second year. Jameson Williams will start coming into his own as well. And a guy that I think is really going to break out. We saw glimpses at the end of last year and in the playoffs, but Jahmyr Gibbs, I think, is going to break out and be one of the best running backs in the entire league. He's a huge fantasy threat. I'll definitely keep an eye out on him for fantasy, but he is going to be huge this year. Jared Goff, behind that great offensive line, can be lethal. He's a guy that needs protection, is going to get protection from that great offensive line. The question mark for the Lions is, can they handle this pressure? They went into last year with expectations, but they were kind of tempered expectations. This year, those expectations are not tempered. A lot of people are picking them to win the division. Some people are picking them to go to the Super Bowl. Even less people are picking them to win the Super Bowl. But the Lions have not had these kind of expectations, at least in my lifetime. And I don't know if they've ever had these expectations in the Super Bowl era, maybe outside of a couple of years with Barry Sanders. But even then, I think everybody knew there was kind of a ceiling to that team. So this is the biggest expectations that the Lions organization has had pretty much ever, at least in the Super Bowl era. And can they live up to that? And can they take those expectations and still perform on the field? It'll remain to be seen, but I'm really bullish on this Lions team. I like a lot of what they do. I like Dan Campbell. I think he should pull back the reins on the aggressiveness a little bit, but that's what makes him great, and that's what makes this team great as well. And then we'll go to the team that finished second last year in the NFC North, and that is going to be the Green Bay Packers. And I'm bullish on the Green Bay Packers as well. I really like the teams in this division, at least the top three teams. But the Packers, youngest team to win a playoff game in I think like 50-something years or 60 years. You had to go back to a team in the 60s, one of the Buffalo Bills teams in the 60s. Young players all over the place. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, Luke Musgrave. You bring in Josh Jacobs from the Las Vegas Raiders, who was one of the best backs in the league. You draft a guy like Marshawn Lloyd out of USC, who I think could be a good contributor for the team. They are stacked and they are loaded and they are young on the offensive side. The biggest question mark for them is, can Jordan Love continue what he was at the end of the last season, in the regular season, in the postseason, in both postseason games? Can he continue that stretch? Because he looked like he was their third guy in line. Of course, they've had Brett Favre, Aaron Rodgers. Now it looks like the torch has been passed for a third time to Jordan Love. And if he can continue that play, I can't believe you can go from those three guys and continue that level of play, but it looks like what they would be able to do in Green Bay. I'm very bullish on this team. Question marks on the defensive side. You still have good defensive talent there, guys like Jair Alexander. Still good defensive talent there, but got a little bit better at the end of last year. Needs to improve a little bit more. I think they'll compete in the division with the Lions, and I think they'll compete in the NFC overall as well. Then we'll move to the Chicago Bears, and this is another team I'm bullish on. Like I said, I love this division. At least the top three teams. We'll get to Minnesota here in a little bit, but I love what the Bears did this offseason. Of course, you draft Caleb Williams out of USC, number one quarterback in the draft, number one overall pick. Really like his skill set there, and I really think it could translate well to the NFL. But not only did they do that, but they made sure that they surrounded him with as much help as they could. You bring in Keenan Allen from the Chargers. You bring in DeAndre Swift from the Philadelphia Eagles. You draft with your second first-round pick at the number 9 position, Rome Odunze, the second best wide receiver in my opinion in this draft behind Marvin Harrison Jr. So they surrounded Caleb Williams with tons of weapons. This is a 7-win team. I know they had the first pick in the draft last year, this past draft, but they were still a 7-win team. That wasn't their pick. That was the Carolina Panthers pick. And they were a team that was vying for a playoff spot at the end of last season with Justin Fields. And I think Caleb Williams is a bigger upgrade at the quarterback position. So really bullish on this Chicago Bears team. Can Caleb Williams come in there and lead this offense? Because they have the pieces to be a really good team. I think they're a sneaky playoff team. I don't think they'll win the division. They may compete for the division, but I definitely think they'll be a wild card team, but I'll get to that a little bit later in my preview show. But really bullish on this Bears team. Biggest question mark is going to be Caleb Williams, because the weapons around him are lethal, and if he can use them correctly and get up to speed right away as a rookie, this can be a really good team. And then finally, we'll finish out the NFC North with the Minnesota Vikings. And the Minnesota Vikings, I feel bad for them. I think they're going to be a solid team, but they're just going to be in a very tough division. And looking at this team, I think there's just a ceiling to how good this Minnesota Vikings team can be with Sam Darnold at the helm. Can Sam Darnold have kind of like a career renaissance like Geno Smith did a couple years back with the Seattle Seahawks? He's been in bad organizations, whether it was the Jets or the Panthers. Backed up Brock Purdy last year in San Francisco and came in some mop-up duty opportunities and looked pretty good. But he has the weapons, of course, Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and then you have Aaron Jones at the running back position, TJ Hawkinson at the tight end position. So he has the weapons. He's going to get the most support that he's probably ever gotten. Kevin O'Connell is supposed to be somewhat of a quarterback whisperer as the head coach position, so he's going to get the help that he needs. I still think there's a ceiling there. The defense got better last year under Brian Flores, but maybe not good enough. They lose to Neil Hunter, their star defensive end. He goes to Houston. That's a big loss there. So I think this Vikings team will be good. Unfortunately, they're in a really good division, and that may come to bite them, and they may end up losing games that or maybe their record doesn't look as good as other teams, but they might be better than other teams, but just in a tougher division. But either way, I think there's a ceiling. Love Sam Darnold at USC, but he hasn't shown any glimpses of being a competent starting quarterback in the NFL really in a long time. So question marks are still out there. Do we see J.J. McCarthy? I don't think we should. I think J.J. McCarthy is not ready to be an NFL starting quarterback, at least not this year. But like I said, really bullish about this NFC North division. I think there could be 3 playoff teams that come from this NFC North division, and I think it's going to be a really, really competitive division. And that has been my breakdown of both the AFC and NFC North divisions. We're going to go ahead and move to college football now. To my second topic, I'm going to go ahead and break down and get to the biggest question marks in the Big Ten Conference. Of course, the Big Ten Conference is now 18 teams with the additions of USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington coming in this year. But still the biggest question mark for me has been what's kind of been the biggest question mark the last couple seasons, and that is Ohio State. And can Ohio State get back on top? Ohio State ran this conference for almost 2 decades, both in the 2000s and the 2010s. And then the last 3 years, Jim Harbaugh and Michigan have slapped them around and taken over as the top dog in this conference. Does that continue? Obviously, Jim Harbaugh is gone, and he is coaching the Los Angeles Chargers. So can Ohio State and Ryan Day get up to that number 1 spot again? They have the team to do so. They brought in a lot from the transfer portal, whether that was Quinshon Judkins, the running back from Ole Miss. He transfers over to go ahead with Travion Henderson and creates, without a doubt, the best running back duo in the entire country. You bring in Caleb Downs from Alabama. He's one of the best defensive players in the country. You pair him with guys that stayed and didn't go to the NFL, like a Jack Sawyer, like a JT Tuimoloau on the defensive line. This team is absolutely stacked. And there is no reason this team should not be the Big Ten champions, I think, in my opinion, and should not vie for a national championship, at least be in the top 4 in the college football playoff, at least get to the semifinals of the college football playoff. And then the next question on a lot of people's minds is Oregon. A lot of people have Oregon as the next best team in the Big Ten. I would be one of those people as well. Can they come in and win the conference right off the bat? You bring in Dylan Gabriel, the transferred quarterback from Oklahoma. He has a very similar style of play to Bo Nix, so it's supposed to be a pretty seamless transition for Dylan Gabriel and this Oregon team. Bring in Evan Stewart, the wide receiver, the former five-star wide receiver from Texas A&M. Can he kind of live up to the potential that a lot of people had for him going into his career at Texas A&M? Still a really good defensive team, underrated defensive team. Dan Lanning seems to be coming into his own. So this Oregon team is going to be a very good team. Can they beat Ohio State? They get in Ohio State, I want to say in November, October or November. I think it's October 12th is when they get Ohio State in Eugene. That is probably going to be the game of the year in college football, or one of the top games of the year in college football. That'll be a big game. But either way, can Oregon come in, kind of have a seamless transition and win the Big Ten Conference in their first year? That would be something to talk about as well. And then moving on, no team, I think, will benefit more or could have used a 12-team playoff and a division-less Big Ten the last couple of years than Penn State. Penn State would probably have made a 12-team playoff the last 3 or 4 years. They would have loved to not have divisions in the Big Ten and have to play Ohio State and Michigan every year. So this is Penn State's time to shine, and can they do it? Drew Aller returns as their starting quarterback. This is the second year as a starting quarterback. So we'll see what we can get from Drew Aller. Not just that, they have a good running game, solid offensive line. You know they're going to play good defense, even though they lose Manny Diaz to be the head coach at Duke. They bring in the head coach from Indiana, Tom Allen, to be their defensive coordinator, so that should kind of be more of a seamless transition. Do they play better on the offensive side? They have not been good on the offensive side for a while. You bring in Andy Kotelnicki, the offensive coordinator from Kansas, who did some great things there. He is now the offensive coordinator for the Penn State Nittany Lions. Does that improve? Can he get Drew Aller, who was a five-star quarterback that came in a couple of years ago, to live up to his potential? But either way, this is Penn State's time to shine. Do they shine, and do they finally get to the place that a lot of people thought they should have been in recent years, or could have been at least in recent years as well? And then let's look at the two teams that are in this conference that competed for a national title last year, that have new coaches and are potentially in a rebuild, and that is Michigan and Washington. And the question for me is, how much of a rebuild is it in those two places? We'll start off in Michigan. I think the rebuild is pretty significant in Michigan. Not only do you lose Jim Harbaugh, you lose J.J. McCarthy, you lose Blake Corum, you lose Roman Wilson, you lose your entire starting offensive line, you lose good players on the defensive side, you lose your defensive coordinator. You lost a ton in Ann Arbor for the Michigan Wolverines. Now you do keep some continuity. You hire Sharon Moore, who coached in 3 games last year in the Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State games last year when Jim Harbaugh was suspended. So that's a big addition there. You bring in some guys from the portal. I think that can help. But a lot of question marks for this Michigan team. Alex Orji is supposed to be the starting quarterback going forward. Really good, talented player. Don't know how great of a quarterback he is. But I think the rebuild is still pretty significant. I don't know how great of a season Michigan has. I think they take a little bit of a step back from last year. And in Washington, I think it's even more significant. You lose Kalen DeBoer, goes to Alabama. Michael Penix is in the NFL. Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk. Basically all of your top offensive players are in the NFL now. Some of your top defensive players in the NFL now. And some of the guys that didn't go to the NFL transferred out of Washington. You bring in Jedd Fisch. I love that hire. He did great things at Arizona in this short time there. Turned around that program in a pretty quick motion as well. So I think they'll be better going forward. This year will be a struggle just because you bring in Will Rogers, the quarterback from Mississippi State. That's a decent pickup, but who's he going to be throwing the ball to? I think both these teams are going to have transition years. They'll both be bowl teams. They'll both probably win 7-8 games. But I think that's kind of the ceiling for both these teams. Maybe a little bit higher ceiling for Michigan, since there is a little bit more continuity there. But still, I think both these teams have a pretty significant rebuild on their hands. And then we'll move to my team, and that is USC. And the biggest question mark for USC is defense. Whole new defensive staff. I thought great hires. You bring in D'Anton Lynn, who was the defensive coordinator at UCLA last year, and was the guy behind the biggest turnaround on defense in the country last year. You bring in Eric Henderson, who was the defensive line coach for the Rams, and now he's the defensive line coach for you. Coach guys like Aaron Donald, Kobe Turner, who was the defensive rookie of the year last year. You bring in Matt Entz to be your linebacker coach. He was the head coach and 2-time national champion head coach at North Dakota State, one of the powerhouses in the FCS. You bring in Doug Belk, who was the defensive coordinator at Houston, to be your defensive backs coach. Matt Entz will coach the linebackers. So elite hires by Lincoln Riley, a really good staff. Do they have the dues to play on defense? I think they have. Their defensive roster is a little underrated. They brought in some good guys from the transfer portal from UCLA, like Amari Ramsey and John Humphrey. From Oregon State, the twins there, in both the Arnold twins, Achille Arnold and Easton Masterkiss or something like that, Arnold. So you brought in guys I think that could play in this scheme. But if USC can just have like a top 50 defense with the way that Lincoln Riley coaches and plays and calls the offense, they're going to be a threat in this conference, and I think they could be a threat, but it's all going to be on the defensive side. It's all on D'Anton Lynn, and if he can turn around this defense and get them playing just some sort of competent defense, which they haven't done in the last 2 years. And then my question for the Big Ten is just like the question I had last week for the SEC. How deep is this conference? Can teams like Wisconsin, Nebraska, and Iowa compete for a conference championship, or at least get to the conference championship? Wisconsin, second year under Luke Fickell. You bring in Tyler Van Dyke, the quarterback from Miami, to be your starter. What are they going to look like in Luke Fickell's second year? Nebraska, do they finally bounce back? This is Matt Rule's second year. Historically, for Matt Rule and his college programs, whether it was Baylor or Temple, the second year you did see a bump. So does Nebraska take that next step? And Iowa, does Iowa play some sort of offense? Because just like if USC had a competent defense, they would be a threat to win a national championship. If Iowa had a competent offense, they would be a threat to win a national championship as well. So that's a big question mark there. And then the last two teams I wanted to talk about in the Big Ten are Rutgers and Maryland. Two teams that I like their coaches in both Greg Schiano and Mike Locksley. Two teams I think are heading in the right direction, but is bowl eligible the absolute ceiling for these two teams? Like, is it just 6 wins and that's what you're looking for these two teams? Or is there more potential for these two teams? I don't know if they're conference champion contenders, but can they be spoilers and maybe, knock off a Michigan and get them out of that contention, knock off a Penn State and get them out of contention? Like I said, I like their coaching staffs. I like the direction of both these teams. Both these teams are also going to benefit from divisionless Big Ten, so they don't have to play Ohio State and Michigan every year like they have had to do. But we'll see. Are they just bowl eligible teams? But that is my breakdown on the Big Ten. There were some other teams I didn't really get to talk to, whether I was UCLA, Purdue, Northwestern. Don't really have much high hopes for those teams. Minnesota. We'll see what happens in the Big Ten. I think the Big Ten has a really good chance to get three, potentially four teams in the college football playoff, which should be a really good competitive conference this year, especially with the new additions from the Pac-12. And let's go ahead and finish off my show. We're going to move to baseball, and we're going to get to my top 5 catchers. As I mentioned, my friend Nick over the weekend asked me just that simple question, and he's like, you should throw it into your show. And it's like, hey, screw it. Let's throw it into the show. Let's go ahead and start with my top 5 catchers all time. I'm going to start at my number 1 position, and that is, or at my number 1 spot, and that is going to be Johnny Bench. Of course, the catcher for the Big Red Machine, the Cincinnati Reds, back in the 70s and 80s. Johnny Bench, 2-time MVP, National League MVP, 2-time World Series champion with the Cincinnati Reds, 14-time All-Star, and 10-time Gold Glove winner. One of the best all-around and maybe the best all-around catchers, both defense and offense. Johnny Bench was a threat on both sides of the ball, and just a guy that was a really big catalyst and one of the big reasons why that Cincinnati Reds team was so successful in the 70s and 80s. Next, we have Yogi Berra, of course, the catcher for the New York Yankees in the 50s and 60s, I believe, 50s and 60s. Listen to these stats for Yogi Berra. 18-time All-Star, he played 20 years in the league, 10-time World Series champion, 3-time AL MVP. Now, he played kind of before the Golden Glove Award was really awarded. Wasn't the greatest defensive catcher, I will admit that, but his offense was great. Was a leader of that Yankees team that won 10 World Series, as much as that pains me to say, as you can see as a Red Sox fan, but was one of the unspoken leaders of that team. And catchers are kind of one of the leaders on the field along with shortstops, but catchers call the game. A good catcher will call the game, doesn't rely on their coach, doesn't lean on the pitcher that heavy. A good catcher will call the game, and a guy like Yogi Berra called the game for a lot of big games. I believe he was the catcher for Don Larson's perfect game in the World Series, still the only perfect game in World Series history. So at number 2 spot, I have Yogi Berra. At the number 3 spot, this is going to be a little bit of a surprise to some people, but this is probably the best. This is the best catcher that I saw, and that was Ivan Pudge Rodriguez, 14-time All-Star, World Series champ in 03 with the Marlins, MVP, I believe, in 98 with the Rangers, 13-time Gold Glove winner. You can make the case that Pudge Rodriguez was the best defensive catcher in baseball history, but he was also, as you can see, as he won an MVP, he was a 14-time All-Star, was also lethal at bat, was also lethal on the offensive side. He's a guy, like I said, probably one of the second best all-around catcher behind Johnny Bench, but a lot of people can make that argument. Different eras, so it's a little bit tough there. But Ivan Rodriguez, great defensive catcher, called great games, and like I said, was very good at the plate as well. So Ivan Rodriguez is my number 3 catcher in my top 5 list here. And then to go ahead and round out the last 2 here, my number 4 catcher all time is going to be Carlton Fisk. Carlton Fisk was, of course, the Red Sox catcher. Not a homer here. I never actually got to watch Carlton Fisk play, so you can't exactly call me a homer, but 11-time All-Star, Rookie of the Year, and a 2-time Gold Glove winner as well, and has the second most home runs as a catcher. So he's a guy, he hit for power, he hit for average, was a solid defensive player, not the greatest defensive catcher on this list, of course, but a solid defensive player, 11-time All-Star, so he did it for a long time at a high level. So Carlton Fisk is my number 4 catcher on this list. And at number 5 to round this out, going to be another guy that I got to see, and that is Mike Piazza, 12-time All-Star, Rookie of the Year, and he has the most home runs as a catcher. Played a little bit of first base at the end of his career, but still played the bulk of his career, about 80 to 85% of his career as a catcher. This guy was clutch. He would come up with big hits. Solid defensive catcher, not the greatest defensive catcher, as you can see, no Gold Glove winnings here, but still a very serviceable defensive catcher. But the best, probably offensive catcher on this list is Mike Piazza. You could hit for average, you could hit for power, as you can see, most home runs as a catcher. But that'll round out my top 5. So just go ahead and list it one more time. Number 1, I have Johnny Bench. Number 2, I have Yogi Berra. Number 3, I have Ivan Pudge Rodriguez. Number 4, I have Carlton Pudge Fisk. And then at number 5, I have Mike Piazza. Would love to hear comments, or if you want to just DM me or text me, if you know me, who your top 5 catchers are. Gary Carter was a guy that could have been in there. Roy Campanella, Josh Gibson. There was guys that I might have left out that people may have in their top 5. But either way, that is my top 5. And that has been my show today. Thank you for watching and listening. Of course, if you prefer the audio version for this show, it is available on places like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. Or if you prefer the video version, it is available right here on YouTube under Sports Talk on a Budget. Please like, subscribe to the show right down here. Thank you again for watching and listening, and have a great day.